Suicide is a complex issue with no single cause. I think for all of us, we would love to be able to point to one or two or three specific things that are the actual cause and reason for this. Be a lot easier to actually address it, right? And actually be a lot easier to measure how you're doing as far as making a dent in improving this. But there's not a single cause of suicide. More often than not, it's the result of the complex interaction of when we talk about risk factors and then we talk about protective factors that individuals have. You can have a number of risk factors, and we'll look at what some of those are here in a minute. But if they're offset by a good number of protective factors, that can actually kind of reduce the likelihood of someone engaging in what we call self-directed violence, or attempting suicide. And risk factors are basically characteristics that are associated with an increased likelihood of suicidal behaviors. And then, of course, protective factors are things that minimize the risk at all levels of suicidal behaviors. So risk and protective factors. Some of the risk factors we look at are if people have had prior suicide attempts, they are more likely to attempt again in the future. And there's actually a theory that Dr. Joyner is kind of an expert on suicide and research on suicide. And one of his theories is that essentially people will kind of build up a tolerance to try and actually end their life by suicide. The idea being that we're kind of hardwired not to harm ourselves in a fatal way. And so there's some, in some instances, folks have to kind of work up to that. If they have mental health issues, various different backgrounds and diagnoses of mental health issues, substance abuse issues, folks that are using illicit substances, we know are more likely to accidentally die. But they're also potentially more likely, to engage in some sort of self-directed violence when they're not thinking clearly. Access to lethal means. So one of the things to keep in mind is if folks actually have easy access to firearms, if they have access to other things that they can harm themselves with. Think about that slide about the time of where you go from actually deciding that you're going to actually harm yourself to actually harming yourself. It's usually within that first hour. So if you have easy access to lethal means, it makes it a lot easier for you to potentially end up dying by suicide. A recent loss, friends, loved ones, could be also folks that had if you had a friend or family member, or for veterans, a battle buddy who had recently died by suicide, it can increase your risk as well. Legal or financial challenges, relationship issues. We have a number of cases, as you might imagine, that we get involved with where a relationship is blown up, and that was a precipitating factor. Unemployment, homelessness, things of those nature. Protective factors, I think access to mental health care or mental health treatment, a sense of connectedness. And so that could be one of those pieces where you all come in, just with being mentors, just folks, just having a connection to you guys, having a connection to other support systems within our community, whether it's, support groups or churches, religious organizations, civic organizations, whatever it might be for those individuals. Having problem-solving skills, that's incredibly helpful, so that if you have major problems, you're not, defaulting to kind of a final solution that you really can't take back. Sense of spirituality. We do have a number of folks that, one of the things we'll hear fairly often in Indiana here is we have folks that don't want to end up dying by suicide because in their belief system that they will, end up kind of going to hell. And so they don't, that's basically kind of how they don't want to meet their maker that way, so to speak, right? That's a protective factor for some people. Having a mission or purpose, having a sense of worth and actually having something that you do is a protective factor. Obviously, being healthier is a protective factor. Being employed and just social and emotional well-being. So, thing to keep in mind is suicide is actually preventable. Oftentimes, we think that it's not. Oftentimes, we often say that this is just such an overwhelming problem that there's no way we can make a dent in this. There's no way that things can ever improve, but it is actually preventable. So we're going to talk about some common myths versus reality. So one myth is that people who talk about suicide are just attention seeking, and the reality is that no matter how casually or jokingly someone makes a suicide threat, we still want to take that serious. And more than likely, if that's brought up by somebody, chances are in some way, shape, or form that they're hurting, right? They're not doing well. And so we want to make sure that we provide them an opportunity to be able to discuss what's going on with them. And we want to make sure that we take it seriously so there's a chance to intervene before they can actually engage in some sort of suicidal behavior. And we actually have this come up in instances where we could have individuals actually call into the VA and they'll basically kind of leverage things, right? Like, I'm going to do this to myself if you don't do this for me. And in most of those cases, we know they probably are not going to engage in self-directed violence, but we still need to take that seriously and we still need to respond appropriately. Next myth is the only one who can really help someone who is suicidal is a mental health counselor or therapist. It's understandable that that would be a belief of a lot of folks. Again, suicide's a topic that most of us are not super comfortable with discussing. It's not probably, if you're around the dinner table with friends or family, this is probably not a topic that's going to come up. It's not one of those things we typically talk about a whole lot. But reality is that special training is not actually required. You don't need to have letters behind your name or have gone to grad school or whatever to be able to help somebody. You can help someone feel included, and you can show genuine, heartfelt support. And essentially, just being present there with the individual can actually make a huge difference. The fact that you're actually with them, the fact that you care, the fact that you're going to walk with them through whatever that they're dealing with can actually make quite a difference. Okay, so the steps of S.A.V. So the steps are, the S is signs of suicidal thinking. You want to be able to recognize those. The A is asking the most important question of all. We'll get to what that is here in a minute. V, you want to validate the veteran's experience. And E, you want to encourage treatment and expedite getting help. Okay, so signs of suicidal thinking. So you want to learn to recognize these warning signs. So if you're with someone and you're interacting with them and you notice just from what they're saying, from their body language, from what's going on with them, that they're hopeless, that they are feeling like there's no way out, that they're feeling like they're a burden to everyone around them, that the world potentially would be better, life would be easier for those that are in their orbit if they were not around anymore. If they're anxious, if they're really agitated or just a lot more jittery than they normally would be. Also, if if they mention, or you're just aware of the fact that they're having problems sleeping, and that's been going on for quite some time, or if just in your interactions with them, their mood is all over the place. Like in 1 minute they're up here, the next minute they're down here. If they don't have any reasons to live is another sign. That's definitely one we really want to pay attention to. If because folks can be going through a really difficult time, but if they can communicate and they're very clear about the fact that they have a specific purpose, they have a specific reason to live, that's a relatively strong protective factor for folks. If they don't have any of that, it's definitely something we get concerned about. If they're engaging in risky activities without thinking, and kind of an example that I often give is I worked with a veteran in the past who would, you could say, was an adrenaline junkie, but at the same time, basically what he was doing was, riding around 465 on a motorcycle without a helmet on, going as fast as possible, well over 100 miles an hour, and doing that essentially just not caring what would happen to him. It's just this ambivalence about life, this fact that, I just don't care if something happens to me, fine. I don't, no big deal. Um, or it could be just, could be risky sexual behaviors. It could be risky illicit drug use. It could be things that they may know is not necessarily that aren't isn't healthy behaviors. They aren't healthy behaviors, but they don't care, and they're still engaging in them, and they're doing what they're doing. Increasing alcohol or drug use, of course, is something that we get concerned about. Um, Part of that, of course, can relate specifically just to dependence or addiction, but the other piece of that could be just a lack of caring for themselves too. Just the idea of like, who cares what happens to me? Might as well just do this because I don't care, you know? Um, Withdrawing from friends and family, just the idea that you're isolating and avoiding people more than normal. So for you guys, it could be instances if you have someone that you have a mentor relationship with and they just kind of fall off the grid, right? Like it's almost like they're ghosting you. They're not engaging, or if they are, it's just very minimally compared to how it had been in the past. That's potentially something that you're just going to want to watch, and just, it might not be suicidal. It could just be mental health related, but either way, that's something that you want to check in on. And so the presence of any of the following signs were ones that would require immediate attention. These are things that if they're going on, we want to actually proactively do something about it. So if they're thinking about hurting or killing themselves, if they're looking for actual ways to die, um, that could be in a number of different ways. They could be Googling things online. They could be looking things up on YouTube. You can find on YouTube, like, instructions and videos of how to tie a noose, crazy things like that. Or if they're Googling how much medication they need to take to possibly overdose, right? Any type of behaviors like that, looking for ways to die, talking about death, dying, or suicide. That's not a normal thing for people to tend to freely bring up and discuss, and just kind of haphazardly just, have come up in conversation. Um, Self-destructive or risk-taking behavior, any of those things, especially when it involves alcohol or drugs or weapons. So any of those things are going on, we definitely want to have a response.
So Craig, I have a question on the signs, because you talked about that it's an hour from decision to action, but obviously the signs exist well before that hour happens. It's like they're contemplating action. Is there any sense of how long that happens? Is this something that comes and goes? Is this something that is very intense for a week, or is there how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the tricky thing is that it varies person to person, right? So like there are people that when we're looking at just medical charts and folks that we interact with, where they can kind of consistently have, like, their baseline, so to speak, could be that they consistently think about suicide. Like there are some people that's just kind of a normative part of their life. For those people, the question, then the follow-up question, which we'll get to here, is, basically like, okay, if you're thinking about it, what have you identified ways that you're going to harm yourself? Have you actually engaged in any behaviors to actually harm yourself? Kind of getting into more specific questioning just to kind of figure out where that's at. Because some people may just tell you, like, if you ask them, they may be like, well, yeah, this is what I think about this all the time. Like, this is just not any different than yesterday or the day before. And then, follow-up questions are what would be appropriate in those cases. For other people, it can be fleeting. It can just kind of come up occasionally one day, and then it doesn't for like another, week, 2 weeks. It can be random. It can be random. And so in some cases, we can point to the fact that it's certain, circumstances and situations in life, some of those, like if some of those risk factors surface, like, say you weren't last month, you didn't have any financial issues. Now you do. Like your relationship was going well. Now it's not. You had a big fight, yesterday with your significant other, some of those things. And so that's why we want to look at just some of these things, just because some of these things could be kind of the precipitating factors that can increase the likelihood of someone having thoughts of suicide. Right. So, I mean, the unfortunate thing is there's not there's not a one size fits all. There's not it's different person to person. And, I think the reality, it's one of the things that I think you guys probably enjoy about doing what you do as mentors is that every person you work with is different. It's also one of the things that's hard about what you guys do is that every person is different. So it's kind of consistent with that is and no different than that is kind of when we talk about stuff like this.
Thank you.
I wish it was more simple.
That was helpful.
Yeah, it'd make things a little bit easier for everybody. But
yeah.
So and thank you for the question. For asking the question, want you to know how to ask the most important question of all, and that is, are you thinking about killing yourself? And a couple of things you'll notice about this question. It's kind of an open-ended question. It's also a pretty specific question. Like the verbiage in this is pretty specific. Are you thinking about killing yourself? That way you're actually getting to the specific self-harm, right? You're getting to the idea. And the thing is too, even like one's thoughts tend to progress too, right? Like, so they tend to progress from, it could be someone could wake up in the morning and just not necessarily wish they were dead, but would have been okay if they wouldn't have woken up. And then it can progress to having actual thoughts of wanting to harm yourself. And then it could progress to, okay, well, how would I actually harm myself? And you get to think about how you would actually harm yourself. And then it could progress to not only how, which is the method and how you would harm yourself, but when would I harm myself and where would I harm myself? And so that's when we talk about a plan, we talk about the how, which is the method of how someone would harm themselves, and the when would they do it, and the where. This actually helps you get a pretty good idea kind of where they're at. So are you thinking about killing yourself? And when you ask this question, there's some do's. You want to ask this question if you've identified some warning signs and some symptoms. And I think the thing to know is we don't want you to be shy, or we don't want you to overanalyze actually when you ask this question too, because the reality is the worst case is it's a bit awkward, right? Worst case. And the thing is, people will let you know. Like, I mean, they can be like, no, I'm okay, and then they'll probably clarify kind of why that they're okay. And either way, you're going to get some feedback, which can be helpful just to make sure that that they're okay. But the reality is that this is a situation where they're probably not going to bring this up on their own. And so this actually allows them to know a couple things. It allows them to know that you're comfortable talking about this. It also allows them to know that, you're a safe place to be able to actually discuss this with, and basically kind of gives them the open door to be able to discuss if they are having those thoughts with you kind of during that time frame. We want you to ask the question in a natural way, as best as possible, that flows within the context of the conversation. And so, basically, if you have an observation about how they're doing, if basically they've shared some things with you about, man, this is not going well, like, I got in a big fight last night, or I just lost my job, and you kind of notice that some of those other risk factors are there that you're kind of concerned. This is just one way you could make sure that basically that you think about like the iceberg. You're seeing kind of what's on the surface. This is a kind of way that you can kind of see if there is anything underneath the surface that maybe does need to be able to be addressed. We don't want you to ask the question as if you're looking for a no answer, right? You could ask the question with your tone of voice of like, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Like, I mean, there's ways you can ask that where it's gonna pretty clearly communicate the fact that, yeah, I'm not really too comfortable talking about this. So if you do actually give me an honest answer, like I don't really want to go there. There's ways we can communicate that that's going to make it a whole lot less likely that we're going to get an honest answer and be able to actually truly get to the root of what's going on. We don't want to wait until someone's halfway out the door or at the very, very end of a conversation. Like if you have a half an hour time slot that you're going to be meeting with somebody, and 15 minutes in, it pops in your head, oh hey, yeah, maybe it makes sense to ask the question because these are risk factors I'm kind of concerned about that I've noticed. You don't want to wait till the very end of that conversation to actually bring it up. Like when they're almost walking away from you, their back is like to you. You don't want to bring it up then. So for V, you want to validate the veteran's experience. And so if you do ask the question, you identify some risk factors, and then you ask the question, are you thinking of killing yourself? And then however they respond, you want to validate them. Now you want to talk openly about suicide. And I think one of the things in this too is you want to actually listen more than you speak. And one of the reasons for that is when we're nervous, oftentimes many people tend to speak more and listen less. And we want to recognize that the situation is serious, but we don't want to be judgmental, right? I mean, we don't want to go overboard with kind of normalizing the situation either, but we don't want to be judgmental. We want to reassure the veteran or just the person you have in front of you that help is available. And so when we think about the idea of a validating statement, what are some statements that you guys can think of that when you think of a validating statement, what would some of those be? What would an example of like what that would sound like be? If someone is open to giving that a shot.
Maybe a validation statement could be, I understand your frustration in the situation. I hear what you're saying, and regarding this situation, I would be frustrated too. I can understand how you feel right now. Maybe things like that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a good example. Like you're acknowledging kind of the situation, and you're also acknowledging potentially kind of how the situation would potentially make them feel. And the nice thing about that is that, again, they're going to give you feedback on that. Like if you do a validating statement and you're right, they're like, yeah. And if you're not, they're like, no. And then they'll clarify, no, this is actually what I think, and this is how I feel. Either way, you're going to get a helpful response that's going to help you have a better idea of where they're at. Yeah. So, show this slide. There's some specific practice we typically would do. It's a little bit harder to do that in a virtual training, so you can't necessarily turn to the person next to you when we're in a virtual room here on Zoom. But the general idea is that you don't want to. You want to make sure that you're focused on them and not focused on you and how you're feeling in the midst of that situation. You want to be present with them, and you want to kind of validate their experience, kind of validate potentially how they're feeling, and kind of reaffirm that you're with them and that you're going to stay with them and help them. So one way you can look at this is that S.A.V is kind of like CPR. Okay. So in the sense that what you guys do in a situation like this is think about with CPR. With CPR, you're essentially doing what you need to do to keep someone alive to get them to the professionals, right? That basically are the ones who are trained to be able to take over and actually, address the situation in a more thorough and detailed way. Basically, what you're doing is you're staying with someone and you're helping them get help. You're helping get them to the professionals when they need to get to the professionals. That's really kind of what more of your specific role in this situation and circumstance is. And in many cases, you do wonder if people would have done that, if people would have not ended up dying by suicide. Right. I mean, just having someone who cares, someone who is intentional enough to ask them, are you thinking of killing yourself? And then responding in a kind, appropriate way to try and validate them and help get them linked with professionals who can actually kind of help, in more detailed ways. Like that goes a long, long, long way to making sure that people get the care and the help that they really need. So, and related to that, E is encouraging treatment and expediting getting help. So if you think someone is suicidal, things you do not want to do, you don't want to keep that individual suicidal behavior or a secret. You don't want to leave them alone. You don't want to have this conversation and then just go your separate ways. You don't want to do that. You will want to try to get the person to seek immediate help from their doctor or the nearest hospital emergency room. And then you also have the option of calling 911. And you want to reassure the veteran or the individual you're working with that help is available. And then you also can call the Veterans Crisis Line, which is the national crisis line. So you'll notice this actual slide has the 1-800 number, the 1-800-273-8255. That is and has been the national crisis line phone number for 15-ish years. I think it's been about that long since the National Crisis Line came into existence. Back last June, I think it was, that number transitioned to be 988. So if you've heard about 988, you can call either one of these numbers. The 1-800 number is still valuable, or still works, I should say. But the nice thing is that the National Crisis Line phone number is now 988. And so if you call 988, if it's a non-veteran, they're going to be transferred to one of, I believe it's at least 170 call centers throughout the country that are staffed 24/7. And those folks are trained to be able to actually be able to address people that are in crisis. And they are trained to be able to try and link folks with, if they need to request like a safety and welfare check with local police departments, they'll do that. If it's a medical type crisis, they can contact local EMS and help with the transportation of folks to a local hospital. There's a lot of things they can do. So if they happen to be a veteran, then there's a prompt when you first call 988 to press 1, and it transfers veterans to one of 3 of those call centers that only actually respond to calls from veterans. And so we've got 3. There's one in upstate New York, one in Atlanta, one in Topeka. And then those that for veterans specific cases, what they'll do is they'll do everything I just mentioned. And they'll also offer them the opportunity to have a local referral to their local team. And then those actually come to me and my team. And we kind of the next business day will outreach to those folks and just kind of help connect them and make sure that they're being taken care of and that they have their needs met. So when you're talking with a veteran that's at risk for suicide, some points and things to remember. Needless to say, you want to remain calm. You don't want to have whatever's going on inside, you want to fake it. If you got to do some breathing exercises, whatever you got to do just to kind of keep yourself level, you want to make sure you're able to do that. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, you want to listen more than you speak. You want to maintain eye contact, and You want to act like you're confident, even if the first time this would come up when you guys are meeting with someone. You're probably not going to feel super confident, but you want to try and project that. You want to fake that the best that you can, and you don't want to argue with them. So if they're telling you they're not doing great, like, no, you're doing fine. Things are okay. Things will get better. You don't want to do that. Body language, you want to make sure that that's open and consistent with listening more than you speak. You want to limit kind of your questions. You want to let the individual that you're interacting with do most of the talking, and use supporting, encouraging comments. And you want to be honest with them too, and just let them know that there aren't quick solutions. It's not, we don't have a magic pill, we don't have a magic wand, we don't have, you do these 5 things and all of a sudden life is going to be better, and you're potentially not going to have any thoughts of suicide anymore. Like there's not any formula to this. But thankfully help is available. So if you end up on a phone call with someone that is in crisis, or someone that expresses suicidal ideation during that phone call, you'll want to keep the caller on the line, and you don't want to hang up on them or initially transfer the call. Remain calm, and you're going to obtain as much of the identifying information about that caller as you can, where they're at, confirm that the phone number they're on is the best phone number. And then what you would do, you could do a couple things in your situation. So for us, if it's a veteran, what we would do was we would actually transfer this call. We would do a warm 3-way transfer call to the veterans crisis line. And so you stay on the line with the veteran, introduce them to the veterans crisis line, or in your case, if it's a transfer to the national crisis line, the crisis line responder, national crisis line responder. And then basically you would only hang up once that transfer has actually taken place and you've actually literally done that warm handoff via the phone to the national crisis line folks. And if it's a situation where you're on the phone, that happens, the call drops, you would want to try and call them back. If they've expressed suicidal ideation during a phone call, you start discussing like next steps with them after you've kind of gone through the S.A.V steps, and the call drops. You would want to try and call them back immediately if you can to facilitate that process. If you can't actually get a hold of them, the thing that we would encourage you to do is to still call the national crisis line, or if it's a veteran, call 988. If it's a veteran, press 1. If it's not a veteran, don't press 1. And then let the responder that you speak with, let them know actually what happened. And then this is where it would come into play that it's important for you to know the name of the person you're speaking with. I assume you would know that. The phone number for them and their location or their address. That's one of the reasons why it's important to jot that stuff down. And then what they will end up doing, at least the veterans crisis line folks, I would assume the national crisis line folks would do the same thing. They will actually use the resources that they have in those instances actually to reach out to that individual. And they'll actually do that even over the next couple hours, just to make sure that try to do everything they can to connect with them, make sure that they're safe, make sure that, if they need any additional attention, or if they feel like it has risen to the level with their conversation with them, that they need to call the local law enforcement and request a safety and welfare check for the police to go out there to see if it rises to the level that they could place someone under an immediate detention and transfer them to a local hospital. Or it could be a situation where there's a medical issue or concern, and they would contact local EMS to try and help facilitate getting those folks to a local hospital to get the help that they need. Okay, so again, signs of S.A.V. Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
Real quick, do the folks at the crisis center know how to do the 3-way calls? And I think the tip that you put down there at the bottom for us to practice is a good tip.
Yeah.
I've had a situation where I had somebody about a couple of years ago in a crisis situation. A mentor called me on a Saturday, and we had the three-way call into the mentee, which it worked. Don't ask me how. And if they hang up and we call you guys, are you able to then patch them in pretty quick? I assume you would know how to do that.
Yeah, I think so. I think the main thing to keep in mind is that you know, you would try and facilitate that on your end with like your phone. It's not, the nice thing is with smartphones, it's a little bit easier than, you know, I will say this, with my VA smartphone, it's a lot easier than with my desk phone. My desk phone, we actually have like a YouTube video. We show like nurses as far as how to use those stinking desk phones at the hospital, because doesn't say transfer on the button. It's like not intuitive at all. On our actual like cell phones, it's a little bit easier to do that. And so yeah, the main thing is that like if you're on the phone with whoever, whether it's your mentee or whoever that is, then you would want to facilitate that with the mentee to kind of do that warm handoff. If needed, then what, you know, if the call gets dropped, you on your own, you wouldn't have to try and link them with the crisis line. If needed, if you can't get a hold, like that suicidal information comes up in that first call, the call drops, you try to call the veteran or the individual back and you can't get a hold of them, then at that point you could just take the information from that call that had dropped and you would call the crisis line, give the crisis line responder that information, and then they will actually outreach to the individual. So yeah, I mean, if there's a situation where they want to do a three-way, they can do that if they need to. I think the primary thing is just making sure you guys are aware of that resource in case so, because that's not a good feeling, right? Like you have a call like that drops and you know someone's not doing great. Your options are like, well, I can call local police, or I can go try and find them wherever they are. And neither one of those are necessarily the best options. You could still do those, but in addition to that, I would call the Veterans Crisis Line or the National Crisis Line and let them kind of do what they do too. So it's an additional resource. So yeah, any other questions or anything? All right, well, thank you. Thank you guys. Appreciate the chance to be able to spend some time with you. And definitely if there are any future questions or anything or ways that you know, we can provide, if you guys, one thing just to, you know, Lawanda might have already mentioned this, but if in the spaces that you are in, if it would ever make sense to have brochures on like firearm safety or gun locks, we're fortunate that we have the ability to obtain tons and tons of gun locks. They all have the crisis line, the Veterans Crisis Line phone number on it, which again, still would be relevant for folks that aren't veterans. Lots of other materials that have the Veterans Crisis Line information plastered on it. So if any of that stuff would actually ever be relevant for you guys, it's awesome that you're linked up with Lawanda, because Lawanda can link you guys with us. She's a part of our team that basically is 100% in the community, where we're kind of split, right? So we do stuff like this, but we also work with specifically within our healthcare system too. But yeah, collectively, we can get you guys anything you need. Yep, Ed.
Greg, yeah, thanks a lot. This has been very helpful. Appreciate it.
I was just going to share that. So we share in our confidentiality agreement. It says the only time that we would go outside of confidentiality or bring someone else in accord with Indiana state law, confidentiality will be broken if a participant learns that a child is being sexually or physically abused, or if a participant says they want to harm him or herself or someone else. Yep. And that prompted, you know, and people, and we have them sign that document, both parties, right? The mentor mentee. Yep. And the one situation I can remember where a mentor called me, I mentioned this earlier, on a Saturday evening, like at 6 o'clock, and said, "Hey, I'm talking to my mentee. He's talking about harming himself. He's in a car downtown Indianapolis. What can I do?" And then we fumbled around to try and do a three-way call. In fact, I think I'm quite sure I called Jerry. So we had some time, obviously. And it turned out he wasn't there yet, but he'd been drinking. And what happened was we were able to patch in myself, the mentor, to the mentee. And I knew the mentee from one of the agencies. And just hearing my voice and the mentors, I think really kind of helped him settle down a bit. So, it's not a bad idea to have somebody there that is familiar to that individual. But I would also recommend that you guys do kind of plug in that number for the suicide prevention hotline, the veterans hotline. And then also 211, you can call that, and they have a way to get, if you'll get a person and say, hey, listen, I've got a suicide situation here. They'll put you into a crisis line as well. I'm sure it's a very similar situation if that's, that's an option as well. And of course, plug in 988 also. The other time I had a situation was fairly recently. I had a guy who on the phone, it's a mentee, and we couldn't reach his mentor. He couldn't reach his mentor, I guess, but he called me, and he sounded really down. And I ended up driving downtown, and this was during the day, sat with him in the car and gave him my phone. I called the suicide prevention hotline, said, hey, I've got a friend here, I think I did a lot of what you were saying. So what you've said today really reinforces and is very helpful, Craig. I just want to say that was good, really good information about the non-judgmental piece and just kind of letting them talk, right? And that's what happened. And then I gave him the phone once I got somebody on there to talk to the suicide prevention hotline. I don't think he was ready yet, but it scared me enough that I went down there. So, that may happen. I don't know, but just wanted to share those experiences.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those. And I think the thing that I commend you for all of how you handled that. I think the other thing too that you did that I think is important is that you didn't minimize any of what was going on, right? Like if there's any signs of anything at all, we want to pay extra attention to that. And we wouldn't, in essence, we want to make sure we're doing our due diligence because, if you look at it from just an individual personal standpoint, like pretty hard to live with ourselves if something happens and we knew that we kind of didn't actually act when we should have acted. But probably more importantly than that is that, these are people that we're fortunate to have in our lives and we're fortunate to be able to interact with. And we want to do right by these people too. We want to make sure that they're being taken care of. And if they need extra care and they need extra help, we want to help them get linked with the professionals that can actually help them. And you guys, I'm super thankful that you guys are doing what you're doing because, there's such a need for folks to be linked with other people that can help walk alongside them. And, yeah, super grateful to have a chance to hang out with you guys and to have you all doing what you're doing.